This morning, John Lewis crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge for the last time. I can think of few recent figures that literally embody Romans for us. A young, unruly, loud-mouthed student who spoke out, often undiplomatically, so undiplomatically that when he was actually asked to share a platform with Martin Luther King on the Washington Mall, he was actually asked to tone down his speech a little bit because they thought it might offend Kennedy, the president at the time. That young, loud-mouthed man was one of the original 13 freedom riders. He insisted over and over again at being the front, not, I think, because he wanted a lot of credit, but because he was willing to take the punishment and the beatings that came with being on the front lines. A young man who started SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and who in time lost leadership of SNCC as the tension over how one engaged protest activity grew, and Stokely Carmichael, the fiery man deeply involved with the Panthers, who started lunch programs, wanted to go in a different direction. John Lewis, I suspect, understood this little bit in Romans. For your sake, we are being killed all day long. We are accounted as sheep to be slaughtered. In small ways and large ways, I am sure that he and all of those marching with him felt like sheep being led to the slaughterhouse. And I think of his predecessors. Polly Murray, when she was a student at Howard, actually sat at lunch counters. Decades later, John Lewis organized those lunch counter protests, but he modeled those protests on what had already happened decades before. A group of Howard students went and occupied lunch counter protests. And you know what? Nothing happened. There was no change that resulted from that first wave of lunch counter protests. And I'm sure that the kind of despair those students in the 40s felt when they made every attempt to organize and it failed, when they made every attempt to remind their fellow brothers and sisters, American citizens, their fellow Christians, because let's be honest, those brothers and sisters were Christians who believed in their segregation and their discrimination. I'm sure that they felt unbelievable despair at the time, and the energy, the creativity that just felt lost. And I'm pretty sure that John Lewis felt the same thing, dragged into jail over and over and over again. And yet the promise of Romans, what Paul reminds us of, is that God is always seeking abundant life. God is always seeking justice. God is always seeking mercy and always calling us to seek those things with God. This passage in Romans gets tangled up in all these conversations around predestination, right? God predestines the elect. And the implication in the logic of some is that God predestines those who are not elect. And yet read together with these parables, is not a story of God who predestines some to life and some to death, but a God who is found in the most unexpected of places, in the most ordinary and everyday. Mustard seeds, they're everywhere, and they're teeny and they're little, and every time you put mustard in a bowl of food, there's a seed that escapes and it rolls away. They're teeny, they're small. Leaven is just the thing we use to make the most common and everyday food of so many peoples and cultures, bread. And yet, the kingdom of heaven, the reign of God, is so valuable that it's like a pearl that a jeweler who spends a lot of time around beautiful stones and beautiful jewels, when that jeweler sees one that is so beautiful, is willing to sell everything just to enjoy that one pearl. That is the God that we have. The God who is so full of life and is so willing to enter into suffering with us, not for the sake of suffering, not for the sake of punishment, but a God who is willing to enter into our everyday life with us, knowing that that will cause suffering, but it is for the purpose of joy. What stands out to me about these parables is the kind of joy. The mustard seed is so small and it shelters birds. I don't know what it is about living close to the Columbia River. Maybe that's the thing. But since I have moved to this part of Portland, I hear more birds than I have ever heard in my entire life growing up in Portland. It's beautiful. There are all sorts of different kinds of birds. A mustard seed becomes a bush and a shrub and a tree, which is kind of an exaggeration because they're not. They're just really big shrubs that birds love to be in, that make their home in, that becomes a shelter. God cares even for the birds of the field. And the strength of conviction shown by people like John Lewis, who stood with so many others, is a witness and a testimony to the abundance of God, to the conviction that what God has predestined us for is not wrath, it is not judgment, but what God has predestined, what God wants, what God has promised, and what God will get is life abundant, joyful life found in unexpected and surprising places. So however it is that right now you are struggling, you are suffering, whether it is in small ways or large ways, whether it is the decaying of a body full of age, whether it is the grief at not being able to be with those we love, not being able to touch and hug and sit and share a meal without being worried about who might be contagious, whether it is the grief of not being able to march, whether it is the anxiety of being out and protesting, and the valid concern about the kind of suffering and pain that might come as a result of that, whatever anguish that you are in right now, know that God is with you in that God accompanies each and every one of us so that we, like the birds, can rest and make our home in the branches that is the kingdom of heaven.